So we are going to get started here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California's in-person and online program titled Companions of Minds and Books, H.H. and Matilda Bancroft in Their Literary Industries. Again, thank you for joining us here in person at the club rooms and for joining us virtually on Zoom. My name is Kevin Kosick and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all and host this program. Tonight, we have more than 150 people registered for this presentation. About 40-ish people have registered in person here in the club rooms, and another 120 plus are joining us on Zoom tonight. So for those of you who might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members and our donors. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or donate. Now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled Companions of Minds and Books, H.H. and Matilda Bancroft in Their Literary Industries. And our presenter is author and editor, Kim Bancroft. Round of applause. After teaching for decades at high schools and universities, Kim Bancroft turned her editing skills to the creation of memoirs. Among other books, in 2014, Kim condensed the 1890 memoir of her great-great-grandfather, Hubert Hal Bancroft, called Literary Industries, which we have available this evening. Her most recent book, Writing Themselves into History, Emily and Matilda Bancroft in Journals and Letters, represents 10 years of gathering library research and family stories across California. From her off-the-grid cabin, Kim enjoys weaving together various life stories akin to her ancestors' penchant for saving oral histories. She captured the story of Heyday's founder in the book, The Heyday of Malcolm Margolin, The Damn Good Times of a Fiercely Independent Publisher. A co-written memoir includes Same School, Different Class, a dual memoir about school integration, written with David Waddell. Kim also co-created the oral histories Priscilla Hunter, Building a Tribal Nation, and The Stories of Fred Short, an American Indian spiritual leader. Another book that Kim edited, and which in turn edited her, includes Daryl Babe Wilson's The Morning the Sun Went Down. Got some applause for almost all of these books. Now tonight, Kim Bancroft will discuss the legacy of her great-great-grandparents, H.H. Bancroft, historian of the West and founder of the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, and his second wife, Matilda Bancroft, a writer and historian in her own right. Now, after marrying H.H. in 1859, his first wife, Emily, wrote voluminous letters from San Francisco to her family in Buffalo in the 1860s. 7 years after Emily died in 1869, H.H. married Matilda, who composed volumes of diaries and letters from 1876 to 1910, along with oral histories. I have a very long introduction here. I hope I don't give it all away. I'm going to go right to what you're going to talk about. So in tonight's talk, Kim Bancroft will focus on the remarkable couple's companionship of shared ideals and ambitions in telling the story of the West through very different perspectives. One, a public man, the other, a very private woman. how these two writers of different natures contributed to the literary life in California and beyond, with plentiful challenges and controversies, is sure to provide us all with an interesting evening. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please use the chat and the Q&A functions on Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll take them from the audience here in person and from the audience on Zoom. I guess now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, author and editor, Kim Bancroft.
That was a wonderful introduction, and I can only hope I can live up to it. I want to thank Kevin for inviting me here to speak with all you fine people in this esteemed organization that has been cherishing books for so many years in so many ways. It's really an honor to be here. And first of all, I'd like to note that I think we're all privileged to be here, because this place would not exist were it not taken unceded from the Ohlone Indians. The stories I'm honored to share with you come from all across the West that were taken from Native folks, not to mention Mexicans, whose lands were taken next in line. And so I think we should never forget our debt and remember that the Ohlone people continue to thrive. Now, for my own history and my family history, I found it very useful for visual learners like myself to come up with a family tree that explains some of the relationships that I'll be discussing. And you may be able to see this at home on your Zoom, but here I'm pointing to Hubert Hal Bancroft, the bookseller, printer, publisher, collector, and historian. His first wife, as Kevin said, was Emily, and they had one daughter, Kate. Emily died in 1869, and 7 years later, H.H., as we called him in our family, Hubert Hal, married Matilda. They had 4 children, Paul, Griffin, Philip, and Lucy. And Paul, the eldest son, was my progenitor. Paul begat Paul Jr. and then Paul III. And here I am with my 3 brothers at the very bottom. When I was growing up, I heard quite a bit about the 3 boys that H.H. Bancroft had, but I heard nothing about his wife or the youngest daughter, and certainly nothing about the first wife and her family. Well, it turns out that Hubert Hal Bancroft and Matilda Bancroft were an amazing literary couple. In their marriage, they contributed much to collecting and creating books that would affect American letters in very deep and far and wide ways. In the case of the woman in this marriage, Matilda, some of her contributions have gone hidden in library archives for 150 years. So it's been my pleasure to bring her writing to light, as well as the ambitious literary enterprises of her husband, in which she shared mightily. Now, I have actually 3 subtopics here this evening. First is a kind of meta-analysis of the interweaving roles of H.H. Bancroft's 1890 memoir, Literary Industries, and how my own work developed. So this is a little bit of the history of my history of these books, including Malcolm's book, which I will mention. And they led to writing themselves into history. Second, I'll take a closer look at H.H. and how he developed his library and his histories. And third, I'll provide some more specific information about the wives of H.H. Bancroft, and in particular, Matilda and her contributions that had gone unacknowledged in so many ways. Now, when I speak of literary industries, I'm not only speaking of the activities that H.H. Bancroft did with his bookstore and his publishing and his printing and all of that, but also, of course, the autobiography, the 1890 autobiography. Here is the original, so you can get a sense of the heft of this 800-page tome. Now, what happened for me is that I went to the 2008 opening of the Bancroft Library after its considerable renovation, which was led by the then director, Charles Faulhaber, who was here, a very esteemed director of the Bancroft Library, and his also enterprising wife, Jamie, who's here. And when I went to this renovation opening, I went upstairs to a seminar room, and there was Teresa Salazar, the wonderful curator of Western Americana, who was pictured here. And under a glass case, she had a copy of Matilda Bancroft's 1876 to 78 diary. And she took one look at me. She knew who I was, and she said, "Kim, you should come in here and read your great-great-grandmother's works. She was a writer in her own right." And I swear it was an admonishment like that. I am very embarrassed to say I did not know who she was talking about. I had never heard Matilda's name, and how many of us can name our great-great-grandmothers, of course, but that says something about who gets the credit, correct? But I did as Teresa commanded, and I went in and I started reading these diaries pictured here. And I was surprised to learn about people and places I'd never heard about in my family history, including references that Matilda made to Sister Kate. Who was Sister Kate? Well, that meant I had to go back to the original source. And this is the frontispiece for the original. And as Bancroft called it, this book, Literary Industries, was the history of my histories. Ultimately, he oversaw the writing of 39 of these thick volumes discussing the publishing of his own works, but also how he developed this history of the Pacific West. And he covered in Bancrofts Works books on native races, California, several volumes on California, Utah, Colorado, Texas, Washington, and Mexico. Well, I was surprised to find his autobiography very engaging. It was full of wit and wisdom, self-deprecating humor even. And so I suggested to my father and my three brothers, we each had an original copy, that we should all read it together and share our impressions and even get online and create a website and do these modern ways of sharing information. And they got 100 pages into it and they said, "You go, Kim, you can do this." And so I did. I read all 800 pages. And at the time, Charles Faulhaber, as the director of the Bancroft Library, actually had read the whole thing. Of course, he would, since so much of it is about the development of the Bancroft Library. And I said to him one day, "I'm really surprised by how wonderful this book is. It's so amusing and interesting and full of great historical information about the gold rush in California." And he said, "Of course, I've always thought there was a good short book in there." So Charles sparked my ambition to create that short book. I started editing the 800 pages down for no apparent reason. Perhaps my father and brothers would read it if it was 250 pages, and in that I did succeed. Well, that brings me to my connection to Heyday Books and Malcolm Margolin, much beloved. By then I was connected to Heyday, and it's another great book story. Heyday was founded by Malcolm Margolin, and he's pictured here. His daughter Sadie was in my English class at Merritt College. And she came in one day and she said, "My father wants to speak to you." And I had taught high school before, so I was used to parents coming in to speak to the teacher of their students. And I said, "Sadie, you're in college now, so if you have a problem with me, you need to deal with me directly." And she said, no, my father wants to give you a job." And I said, "Really?" And she said, I showed him one of the essays that I wrote for your class, and you'd written all over it with your feedback and your editing, and he thinks that you would make a good editor. And the work that he gave me was Darrell Babe Wilson's memoir, The Morning the Sun Went Down, a very powerful memoir from a Native man in Northern California. So that pulled me into the Heyday orbit of books. And Malcolm eventually put me to work editing other people's books. I left teaching and decided that's really what I wanted to do, was edit people's books and memoirs if I could. Well, when I mentioned to Malcolm that I had edited H.H.'s memoir and brought it down to a manageable 250 pages, he was interested in publishing it as part of Heyday's effort to put back into print classic California literature from the 19th and early 20th century. He asked to see it, and it became a Heyday book, I was very proud to say, in early 2014. And I believe we got to come here and speak about it. So with all of this work on memoirs, I asked Malcolm one day when he was going to write his own memoir. I knew he was a great storyteller. He had fantastic relationships with authors, with Native Americans. They'd help publish News from Native California, a fantastic journal. And he said, I don't have time to work on my own memoir. I'm working on books. And I said, well, then let me just bring in a tape recorder and I'll put it down in front of you and you can tell stories. You can see the connections here that I was learning about oral histories that came out of H.H. Bancroft's own collection of stories from the early West. So I had learned to do oral histories. I started collecting those stories, and indeed they were wonderful, from his ancestors to his youth to how he came to California, and all of that then became the heyday of Malcolm Margolin. So you can see that there's already a web forming of these interconnected books, publishers, and storytelling. So now I will wend my way back to Emily and Matilda. Over all of those years working on H.H.'s book and then Matilda's, Malcolm's, I had not forgotten these women. I intermittently traveled down to UC San Diego, where Emily's papers were lodged at UC San Diego's Special Archives. And I read and transcribed her letters there. And I went to the Bancroft Library to read Matilda's journals and letters there as well. I now dedicated myself to combing through these women's stories and their letters and journals to pull out what they could teach us about women, families, communities, even national events in the mid-19th century through their very rich descriptions. And eventually their edited stories became this Heyday book over here, completing this wonderful circle of interweaving love of history, literature, publishing. And you'll see from the Heyday book that is also following the principle that Malcolm set up as a publisher to create beautiful books. Actually, you hold them in your hands and you know this is beautiful. And they also sought to make it into a hardback to imitate a 19th century book. So that's my role in all of these books that you're seeing here and hearing about. I'm now going to focus a little bit more on H.H. himself and then lead up to his wives' roles here. At age 16, Hubert Hal Bancroft left his family's home in Ohio and went to work in the bookshop of his brother-in-law in Buffalo. At age 19 in 1852, his bookshop brother-in-law said, we need to capitalize on the gold rush, not with gold, but get books out there to sell to the flood of people coming into San Francisco. And so he sent young Bancroft to San Francisco with a friend to sell books to people who were looking for other entertainment than in saloons. And Bancroft was very enterprising, and he did a great job at this. In 1859, 7 or 8 years later, he returned to Buffalo to restock his supply of books and stationery and to visit family. And on that occasion, he met and then married Emily Ketchum, who was from Buffalo. Well, Emily came back to San Francisco. It takes 6 weeks to get from New York to San Francisco, and the letters travel very slowly along down the coast, no transcontinental railroad until 1869. So Emily spent a lot of time writing to her beloved family back east, and these letters were then collected. She told every kind of story she could writing a little bit on one day, then the next day writing some more, describing her life with her child and her husband, their travels, and other things that were of concern to her. This is the only photo I've ever seen of Emily. Well, meanwhile, H.H. continued to grow his business in San Francisco as a printer and publisher. And now he began collecting all kinds of things. In his memoir, Literary Industries, he recounted how his interest in collecting books and related material on the Pacific West was sparked in 1859 by his desire to create an atlas for the immigrants still coming across the country, the slow way over the mountains. Well, he was quite surprised, he said, to find 50 to 70 books and pamphlets in his bookstore at the time about the West, California, Oregon. And for some reason, this just led him to want to collect more and more. He made a comment in his book, "Why do any of us collect? It's like little boys collecting marbles, just want more and more and more." Well, eventually, as he was growing his business, and it was the Premier Bookshop on Market Street in San Francisco for the whole West at the time. You can see here in this image, his printing presses at the bottom, the lower floor. The top floor was at that time, the 5th floor, preserved for his collection. And eventually he began to collect researchers and writers who were in his library helping him with this work. It was quite an ambitious project. This idle curiosity, get a sense here of the whole Pacific West, had captured his imagination, and he wanted to have not only books and pamphlets, but also maps, government documents, newspapers, posters, oral histories, anything, letters, journals, diaries from settlers who had come across the West. And he called this in his book, his bibliomania, that he had this craze. Wherever he went, he was collecting more and more. And even on trips back east and to Europe, he was collecting materials, going down to Mexico, collecting them in Spanish as well. He was scouring bookstores and then eventually hired agents to look for books for him in auctions. So he also had to hire assistants who would copy some of these documents. For example, some of the documents that came from the city government that he had people copy and put into his library, which became very valuable in later years when San Francisco burned down and those documents were saved in his library. Well, at the beginning of Literary Industries, H.H. gave 2 reasons to explain his motivations for collecting his library and creating his histories. First, he said his task was to save to the world a mass of valuable human experiences on the West Coast, which otherwise, in the hurry and scramble attending the securing of wealth, power, or place in this new field of enterprise, would have dropped out of existence. These experiences were all the more valuable for the fact that they were new. Secondly, he said, having secured a vast amount of knowledge which otherwise would have passed into oblivion, my next task was to extract from this mass that which would most interest people in history and biography, properly classify and arrange the same, and then to write it out, and so place within reach this gathered knowledge in the form of a history. In the early 1880s, Bancroft moved his library to this building on Valencia and Army Streets, where St. Luke's Hospital is today. He further explained his process. Meanwhile, he said, the work of collecting books and documents on Pacific Coast history continued while I erected a refuge of safety for the final preservation of my library in the form of a fireproof brick building on Valencia Street in the city of San Francisco. And good thing he did. You see here the burning of his building, all of that smoke and the water going up to it, the flames, that was his building. and it burned to the ground. But fortunately, he had already moved his library to the south of San Francisco, where it stayed safe. Returning to this collection then, the initial 60 or so items that he had, by the 1870s, he had 16,000 items. And by the time he decided and was able to sell his collection to UC Berkeley, he had 60,000 items. And his collection was then sold in late 1905. We know what happened in April 1906. Fortunately, because his library was further south of San Francisco, it was protected in the earthquake and the conflagration and ferried over to UC Berkeley a month later. Now, the Bancroft Library today has 60 million items in it. It's huge, and it's open to the public. It covers all kinds of history from those years and before, including items that you wouldn't even expect necessarily. So I implore everybody to go online and do some treasure hunting. A lot of it is increasingly digitized. So now for my last topic here, the specific wives of specific roles of Bancroft's wives in his literary industries. As to his first wife, Emily, in the 1860s, when Bancroft had begun his collecting, Emily's role as a helpmate to H.H. in his nascent efforts was minimal. I find few references to H.H.'s work in Emily's letters, and that might be part of a separation of the public world and work of men and her private world as a woman, except that Bancroft often brought some of the men in his employ home for dinners and gatherings, and Emily wrote quite affectingly of some of the struggles of those men that she met at home. I did find one description by Emily of helping her husband review a catalog of books, and she found it quite boring. She wrote home, "I've been helping H read and correct a catalog until I wish the book business were in France." But at least it shows that H.H. trusted her literary abilities enough to help him do this editing work. In 1868, H.H. and Emily took a grand European tour during which he was going to bookstores and buying whatever he could at book markets and auctions, but she didn't write about any of his shopping sprees there. However, Emily did have much to say of interest about her observations and experiences everywhere, and they are captured in my book. Sadly, Emily died of kidney disease in 1869. The couple only ever had one child, Kate, one child who lived, actually. H.H. wrote poignantly in his memoir about the impact of his wife's death on him. He was thrown into a great depression. He lamented, "Other men's wives have died before and left them as crushed as I was, but mine had never died. And I knew not what it was to disjoin and bury that part of myself." But he explains in his book that a lady friend soon said to him, "The next 10 years will be the best in your life. What are you going to do with them?" And he took that query to heart. By the early 1870s, Bancroft became focused on using his collection to tell the story of the Pacific West, a process which he related in great depth in literary industries. And for Bancroft to utilize this huge library and fulfill what was an evolving vision of an entire history of the Pacific West, he'd have to use assistance. He noted that it would take hundreds of years if he alone were trying to write what turned out to be these 39 volumes. And he did write most of 10 volumes himself. However, the bound books are called Bancrofts Works, and he was rightly criticized, I believe, for not having included in each volume the names of those assistants who had helped write and research these materials. At least in literary industries, he did share the stories of many of those researchers and writers. And as this image shows, his use of many hands was not appreciated by all, including some of those hands who felt that they should have been given better credit. He claimed that since he had paid the salaries of those assistants, they were working for him and wouldn't have produced those works were it not for his patronage. Unfortunately, he created great distrust by not giving credit where credit is due, which is an ethic we take more seriously today. Well, now we come to Matilda's Rule. By 1876, when H.H. Bancroft met Matilda Griffin, he was deeply at work on these histories. In fact, the first of them are called Native Races. And he was so committed, in fact, that he did not wish to take on a wife who might distract him from this work. He said, "My great fear of marrying was I should fasten to my side a person who would hurry me off the stage, and before my task was done, otherwise so confound me that I should never be able to complete my labors." Nor did he trust the intellectual capabilities of women. He wrote, "Do not all women delight in the fopperies of fashionable life more than in what might seem dry and fruitless toil? Where should love be found? In a female mind of fair intelligence." In Matilda Griffin, we might say. In Matilda, he found a woman equal to his intelligence, his vision, and his work ethic. Her role then became pronounced, perhaps because H.H. recognized that he could use all the help he could get by then. And clearly, Matilda was quite capable, interested, and ambitious herself. So how did Matilda contribute to his projects of all kinds? In several ways, as a writer, keeping a diary, as an editor, and as an oral historian. So first of all, as to Matilda's writings, probably at H.H.'s behest, in 1876, Matilda began to keep this journal that would be useful to him. In this one, in fact, she wrote about their travels from the time of their marriage in the East, and then their journey back to California, and eventually to the Northwest, where he was collecting. Her writing was of interest to him, especially about the people they met, since all along the way, H.H. was collecting dictations or oral histories about some of the major figures in the settling of the West, including, for example, General Sutter, on whose land gold had been found. Matilda's diary provided perceptive descriptions of their travels together while he was collecting all kinds of documents. And note that her writing was not private the way Emily's letters were to her family. Matilda was conscious of her role as a kind of documentarian of this project. And she even said, for example, while in Portland, Mr. Bancroft was busy every moment, but as I did not go out with him, nor hear any of the dictations, I am unable to describe our work here in detail. So she was kind of like a filmmaker making a film about the making of the film. And you note in that quote that she called him Mr. Bancroft, which shows the formal nature of what she was producing. And she also called it our work. So she was very much engaged in taking this on for herself. Matilda wrote 5 other journals, including one for each of her children, hundreds of pages each, begun at their births for the first 10 years of their lives. And she wrote a very long journal about their trip to Mexico in 1891. So her writing was very full, very fluent, and very rich in description. Here is the book that she created for their youngest son, Philip, and a photo of her 4 children. While they were still young, their father was traveling extensively to collect throughout the West, and sometimes his whole family traveled with him, and Matilda documented these travels. She provides references to where he was finding material in Vancouver, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Mexico. Another job that Matilda took upon herself was editing her husband's work, which H.H. taught his wife to do early in their marriage. Matilda explained that she enjoyed this shared work, and so did he. As they worked together, he was also learning from her the value of women's intellectual work. In her own way, Matilda would be vital to H.H.'s literary enterprises, though he had strong feelings against women as scholarly writers, saying that writing was too hard for frail and tender women. He clearly valued Matilda's support of, responses to, and participation in his work. In his memoir, H.H. described the 2 months they spent working together in the relative quiet of rural hotels near San Francisco, like this one, White Sulphur Springs near Napa, which sadly burned down in the 2020 fire. H.H. acknowledged how Matilda increasingly contributed editing help over time. He wrote, "There was little lack of sympathy between my wife and me, little lack of heart and help. All along down the days and years of future plottings, patiently by my side she sat, her face the picture of happy contentment, assisting me with her quick application and sound discrimination, making notes, studying my manuscript, and erasing or altering such repetitions as crept into my work. On the hotel porches used to sit feathery-brained women of fashion from the city. They would sit there and cackle all morning, women of fashion, while we were at our work. I never before so realized the advantage to women of ennobling occupation. Why should she be the vain and trifling thing intellectually that she generally is?" Well, I think we can think of several reasons why that was the case back in those days. And note that he sent all 3 sons to college, but neither of his daughters got to go to college. In her own writing, Matilda also referred to editing her husband's work. For example, in her 1876 journal, she explained how H.H. taught her to help him as a sharp-eyed critic of his work. She also noted copying work contributed by his daughter, Kate, pictured here. And again, there were no copy machines in those days, so you needed somebody to sit and copy perhaps whole books out. Matilda wrote, "At White Sulphur Springs, the library or working room was filled with books pertaining to our subject, and together we were engaged every morning writing. Kate, in an adjoining room, was busily employed in copying for her father. Mr. Bancroft was then writing about the Vigilance Committee, and I was engaged in sorting incidents, rewriting, and arranging them. Always after writing them, I would hand them over to my husband, who would criticize and correct, thus teaching me how to criticize the better his productions, which is also part of my occupation. We were at the Springs too early in the season to see much of the fashionable life usually represented there, which now interest has been made less attractive to me than ever." So Matilda was grabbing up her role as a scholar and fully committed to it. Matilda's third official role was to become an oral historian. She'd learned to take dictations in Vancouver on her husband's collecting trip there, which she accompanied him on in 1878. She herself took down the story of Reverend John Good, saying that after watching her husband and his assistants write down such stories of the early settlers, she, quote, "craved as a favor to do the same." Years later, her role was crucial. in capturing the dictations of Latter-day Saints women in Utah. It may have been inappropriate for a Gentile man to ask personal questions of these women about the family lives when their husbands may have had several wives. But Matilda elicited from her interviewees valuable information, and it included not only about their families and their marriages, but also the plight of the Mormon people as they had been chased out of the East, often violently, and pushed further and further west under great sacrifice and duress. Matilda wrote in her son Griffin's memory book of her work with his father in 1884 in Utah and Colorado. She said, "I took several dictations from the Mormon women and assisted Papa in making extracts from these journals. Later, while in Denver, I worked on all the material we together collected into chapters. This is the most writing and rewriting I've ever done. Papa afterward revised the whole, but left a good deal just as I had prepared it. I enjoyed this work immensely." And here's an excerpt of a dictation that Matilda wrote based on an interview with Jane Snyder Richards, pictured here, the first wife of 8, I believe, of Franklin D. Richards. In this one, however, Matilda's first person voice enters. She wrote, "I could not but think of the narration of hardship I had just listened to from a wife so illy prepared for. Yet she never complained of her lot being hard, though the severe sicknesses she endured, the care of delicate children, the earning of their livelihood by braiding straw hats, keeping boarders and sewing, all combined to make a hard lot harder. It seems as though it needed some divine grace to prevent her from repining at the wisdom of dividing her little heritage with another wife or more." H. Bancroft used his wife's well-done dictations in his histories in relation to Matilda's dictations of Jane Snyder Richards. In his volume on the history of Utah, H. referred to Jane's words in multiple places and even reproduced a portion of her reminiscences to reinforce the suffering of the Mormon immigrants in 1846. H. also included Matilda's dictation among his list of articles on Utah polygamy. Her work was vital to him, but Matilda's name was never listed as a contributor. As I said, on the other hand, he did not list any contributors' names in those volumes, those individual volumes. However, today, one can find Matilda listed in the Bancroft Library's catalog of oral histories in their Oral History Center, including some of the dictations she took of many other pioneers. These stories that Matilda heard from all of these early settlers of the West were filled with the tragedies of their journeys and their hardscrabble existence in mining camps and wilderness villages, distant homesteads. So Matilda received quite an education listening to these stories. And I think she too helped save to the world a mass of valuable information by getting these stories down. I encourage everyone to, again, go to this particular website through the Bancroft Library and look at all of the amazing stories, not only from that time, but brought up quite to the present. For example, stories of the Rosie the Riveters, women who were in the war industry in World War II, and their stories have also been collected. In other less visible, less official ways, Matilda furthered her husband's literary goals. Early on, she pursued related studies, such as learning Spanish and phonography in order to read the phonetic spelling of native languages. While pregnant with her second son, Griffin, she wrote of her study plan in her diary. "I have read 4 volumes of Native Races." Those were the first volumes that H. published as Bancrofts Works. She said, "I've read 4 volumes this winter and have taken up the study of phonography so that my time has not been wholly lost to work in our direct line. Phonography would be a great benefit to me if I could obtain a practical knowledge of it, and that I shall do when I can study and practice it every day for several consecutive months. However, Griffing's birth in another 2 months would force her to drop this plan. Child rearing for her, now with 2 sons and 2 more children to come, took precedence over her many scholarly pursuits, as it often did for intellectual women of her time. Another way to emphasize the partnership in this marriage of minds is one many of us know personally, how a partner or spouse might take up the work of the home and family, allowing the other to delve into business, arts, creative pursuits, scholarship, allowing more time for that person to pursue those endeavors and with greater ease. Such help is not to be taken for granted. Matilda herself was a valued but invisible assistant in many ways. For example, in addition to his scholarly pursuits, H.H. Bancroft oversaw the construction of various real estate projects, many of which Matilda helped intimately. In fact, she supervised the entire construction of this family home in San Diego in the mid-1880s, while H.H. was mostly in San Francisco or traveling elsewhere. And by the way, as I was looking up some of these places and seeing these photographs that were amazing in a family album at the Bancroft Library, I would then, of course, look up this place on 4th and Fur in San Diego, and it's now a parking lot. Finally, Matilda served intellectually as a kind of writing coach for their son Griffin, who became a writer, though not one of great acclaim. I never found any records of where Matilda might have had an advanced education, even a girls' seminary, and certainly not in college. However, she was seemingly tutored in New Haven, where she grew up. In a long letter to Griffin, Matilda revealed her literary affinities. Perhaps to bolster her right to evaluate her son's writing, she asserted, "I studied novel writing with a Radcliffe woman once." In this letter, Matilda critiqued a draft of one of Griffin's manuscripts, and she pointed out both poor and excellent passages, saying some were admirably written and very different from other pages that are weak and schoolboy in style. Ouch. It's difficult enough to receive critique, but especially so from one's mother, who does not hold back. In her comments, though, Matilda also encouraged her son by saying, "This is a most interesting plot that you have worked up and holds interest to the end." Matilda did try to help her son as an editor in a firm but gentle way, and who knows what her literary editing career might have become had she been given free rein. I conclude by emphasizing that this is now an increasingly common story of women working in the background of their more established and public husbands. But especially in the case of Matilda, we see one who contributes in such significant ways and deserves to be recognized. She was intelligent, hardworking, and visionary in her own literary right. Though H.H. Bancroft publicly proclaimed that he did not believe in women's ability to be intellectually equipped for scholarly endeavors, he obviously sought out smart women to accompany him through his life, his business, and literary ambitions. And he found his equals in Emily and Matilda. Thank you. And I eagerly receive your questions.
That was great. Thank you for that. You can stay up here because I'm
Sure.
going to show you what the camera looks like. We're going to keep that slide up for the folks on Zoom just for a minute so they can capture that information, and then we'll shut that off, and people on Zoom will just see our big faces as we talk to you. So we're going to take some questions from the folks here in the club rooms, and there's a couple of questions on Zoom, but we're going to start here in the club rooms. Does anybody have a question or a comment that they might want to make? What? Okay.
Had you really known of your great grandfather's reputation? Had you read any of them?
Repeat the
Okay,
question.
yes. So the question is, how much did I know about my great-great-grandfather's work, and had I read any of it? No. And hadn't read any of it, but my father, Paul Bancroft III, was very proud of his ancestor and of HH's work. And we had all of the 39 volumes in our living room. And when I was about maybe 8 years old, he made sure that I and my older brother had a chance to get a tour of the labyrinth of the underground of the Bancroft Library at the time. And I have a wonderful story that I put in this book about what it was like to go there and to be amazed by what this library held. But it didn't really, I was involved in teaching, and it wasn't until years later and Teresa's admonishment that I decided I need to get in here and do something and understand and read this work.
Great. So let's shut that off, and I'll stop the screen share here. Great. Great. So now I think everybody on Zoom is just seeing us, so they can have some questions. There is the burning question that I don't know if anybody here wants to ask. Maybe you would explain your costume, your attire today.
Yes, well, thank you for asking, because it is kind of odd, and it's not that I'm an odd person. I just think it's wonderful to have a moment to appreciate what Victorian, Edwardian women wore. And I'm telling you, this is pretty hot up here. I know some of you are hot out there, but to think about what it meant to go through the streets that were dust and mud in the 1860s and 70s and 80s and 90s and be wearing this kind of attire. I just want you to have a moment to appreciate that. I certainly do, as I'm wearing this, and it's very hard not to step on my own long skirt. There's a wonderful stories also that, and some of which are in the book, about other layers that went on. For example, Matilda wrote about wearing a corset, which I've often thought was a sort of torture device for women in the 19th century. But she talked about being thrown from a horse, and that the corset saved her when the horse kicked her ribs, and the whale bones prevented her from getting her own ribs kicked. So maybe they knew something we didn't know.
Terry.
So I haven't finished the book completely, but I read up to the part at least where Matilda leaves her firstborn, and I think goes up to Vancouver with HH. Right. So are there any hints in any of her other writing that she missed? What's the second child, second, third, fourth were born, that she missed that component of her life?
Yes. To what extent did Matilda miss getting to do some of the more scholarly or collecting work once she was fully engaged in being a mother of 4 children? There were these opportunities that HH loved his children. He adored his children. And as I mentioned, they often traveled with him when he went on these collecting journeys too. And they were not in regular schools. I have a whole chapter about Matilda as teacher. And so there were opportunities for her to share in some of that work. So when she talks about going to Utah and Colorado, they often had governesses and somebody who was looking after the children. So she did cooperate in some of this work in later years. But there were also times he went off to Mexico. One of the children was very sick, and she lamented that she couldn't go on that trip with him at that time.
So there's a question here on Zoom that says Bancroft's writing enterprise sounds quite labor and capital intensive. Were his history books self-funded through sales, or did the funding come from other sources?
Okay, good question. So I like to show that magnificent image, the engraving of his building, the Bancroft building with the 5 stories. He had by then a huge enterprise that was very much money making. When you think about how few places in the 1860s and 70s were printing and publishing books, he had a great inventory of books from everywhere. Really, it was a premier bookstore, but he was also publishing law books. I'm sure Charles Fallhaber could expound on some of the other activities that he was doing. So he had a really great business. And when he says literary industries, he was kind of an industrialist. And that was typical of a man of his class and time in the late 19th century to be a capitalist who was going to make money, but he plowed that money back into building his library, hiring people to help, and writing these histories. There was an ulterior motive, I would say.
There's also a great question about his histories. And it's really about the trajectory of the general literacy rate at the time. So was there a rising literacy rate? Who were these books being written for? Or why was he so compelled to write these books?
Well, I think in some ways he did think that he was writing these, as I mentioned in the talk, because he wanted to save to the world this information and share it with a general population. But you know, nowadays we are inundated by so much information online, so many books being published, and at the time there just wasn't that amount of information available. So he actually had agents who would go throughout the West, go to small villages, knock on doors, and get subscriptions for these volumes. Now, he was also criticized because he would go and say, well, I'm going to sell you some volumes on the history of California. Would you like to pay your $5 for a volume? And they said, yes. Little did they know that they were actually signing up for 39 volumes, and he got in trouble for that as well. So not everybody necessarily read every page, but people who were from Utah or from Texas or from Washington and the Oregon Territory were eager to read about the history, geology, geography, commerce, everything that he packed into one of these volumes.
We'll take this question
Well,
here.
it's not a question, but the book club published some years ago a book that Gary Koretz found up at the State Library called 6 Years as a Book Agent in San Francisco. A woman who came through the Panama, not canal, but through Panama up to San Francisco, and she got a job with H.H. Bancroft as a book agent and did exactly what you're talking about. Starting, I think, with just selling portraits of President Grant. But it's a fascinating book. It's still available.
Good.
Tom?
Well, in answer to that question, there was a growing interest in other parts of the world in what was happening.
Yes.
And that leads back to another author who you may or may not be familiar with, a female author who supported her family, Mary Halleck Foote.
I've heard of her, yes.
Yes. And I mean, she started in San Jose and documented basically the same thing that H.H. was documenting and did very well at it, thankfully, because her husband, even though he was in charge of some great ventures, every one of them failed.
So we're just past the top of the hour, but there's a couple of questions here on Zoom that really are kind of about the tension between raising a family and doing the work that she loved to do. So I guess the first question is, did Matilda help raise Emily's daughter? Because she came into a family with a daughter.
Yes, so Emily, when Matilda married into the family, by then Emily was 16 years old. And I mentioned how affected H.H. was by his wife Emily's death, but so obviously was Kate. And he wrote very effectively what it was like to hear his 9-year-old daughter wail every night at the death of her mother. But Matilda, when Matilda came in, according to some of the papers from Matilda, letters and her diaries, she embraced Kate and called her Sister Kate. And as she was writing about her in her own children's books, and Kate became very involved in helping raise the children in a sense, becoming their tutor. She was much older than them, of course, but in later years, Kate ended up in San Diego and was very close to Griffin in particular. So I think Matilda, and letters, there's a whole other volume of letters from Kate to her father and to Mama and Papa, as she wrote about Kate, about Matilda in later years. But I think there was an effort by Matilda fully to embrace her and make her part of the family.
That's another San Diego connection. We have some members from Southern California asking about what that San Diego connection was with that house.
Yes.
So we can talk a little bit about
Yes,
that.
so what happened was, and in other talks I've talked about this on my website, I noted that there are past talks and some of them focus on different aspects of the book, but HH had terrible allergies, so they wanted to leave San Francisco where there was such a terrible summer fog, except on days like this, and went to Walnut Creek where they bought some land that eventually went to Philip Bancroft, and his descendants include Ruth Bancroft, who has the Ruth Bancroft garden there. So if you ever get a chance to go to Walnut Creek and want to see an amazing succulent garden, that was once part of the family land. Well, Walnut Creek still was too cold and foggy for HH, and so they continued south and went to San Diego and bought not only land in the city on which they built that house, but also outside of San Diego in Spring Valley. And another thing I found while I was beginning to do all of this research, they were talking about Spring Valley and Helix Farms. And I said, what is that? I've never heard of this. I got online on Google and looked up Spring Valley, and there was the Bancroft Ranch House Museum in Spring Valley. And so they now have the Spring Valley Historical Society located there. So Griffin had several conflicts with his father, who became quite curmudgeonly, HH did in his older years. And Griffin was a little bit of a rebel, and it looks like he decided to land himself in San Diego and stay there. And that's also where Kate ended up and many of her descendants.
So clearly they had the financial resources to acquire land and homes. So someone is actually asking, why was it not a thing to hire nannies and domestics to help with the children so she continue her work?
Well, definitely. And I mentioned they had governesses and they helped tutor, but sometimes they'd come and go. They lived in Walnut Creek at that time. It was very rural. Not everybody would want to live there, but they definitely had help. And Matilda, among her other invisible assistants, was managing a small staff at times. However, it still wasn't proper, I would say, for HH, as he was becoming more part of the upper class, to allow his wife to work so overtly in this kind of function as a scholar. So she was still doing it on the side and doing what she could, if that explains.
So we'll take one last question here from the audience in the book club, if there is one, right over here.
This actually isn't a question. I wanted to thank you so much, because frequently a question will be asked from the floor and the speaker doesn't repeat it, so people who are on Zoom haven't been able to hear it. But thank you. That must be your teaching skills.
So I'm learning. We're always learning. Thank you. I'm learning to make it possible for Zoom audiences to participate as well.
John.
So what's next?
So the question is, what's next?
Yes. Can I just say, stay tuned?
Yes.
That's a great way to end. Stay tuned. Thank you to our presenter this evening, Kim Bancroft, and thanks to you for attending this Book Club of California program. We do have some of the books that Kim has written and edited here in the front of the room. If you're interested in acquiring one, please come on up. She's ready, willing, and able to sign them if you'd like a signed copy. And we hope that you'll join us for our next in-person and virtual program, which is Monday, August 28th at 6 p.m. Again, it's in-person and virtual. It's titled My Biography is the History of California. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo and his Recuerdos is the title. It is, our speakers will be Rosemarie Beebe, who is Professor Emerita of Spanish Literature at Santa Clara University, and Robert Senkowitz, who's Professor Emeritus of History at Santa Clara University. You can register for that program or any of our programs online at bccbooks.org/programs. You could call me, you could email me, kevin@bccbooks.org, and I will sign you up. If you're not getting our emails, please get on our email list. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great evening. Yes, say one more thing.
I just want to I'd like to give a plug for the book about the Mariano Vallejo. It's a really wonderful, amazing translation that they finally made, that H.H. Bancroft had his people take a dictation, and it was never published. But finally, the B.B. Senkowitz team have made it available. And I also want to say those copies of Literary Industries are among the last of the paper copies I had in my closet and decided to bring out because it's no longer available in book form. You can get it digital. So if you'd like one, it's available. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, everyone.